Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us today for our July edition of Talkin' Water as we get the slides up and loaded. And I want to thank everyone for making time out of their busy days today to join us to talk more about their drinking water quality. We'll do a quick overview of some of the functions of the Teams interface here. We could go to the next slide. So with our virtual events, we want to remind everyone that these sessions are recorded. They will be placed on the TVWD YouTube channel later today. Makes it an easy way for everyone to go back and revisit this content if there's anything they wanted to remember or see again later. Please make sure your microphone is muted. If you accidentally come off mute or if you're not on mute, we might mute your microphone just for the smooth flow of the presentation. But we do want to make sure folks are able to engage with us and ask questions. So please remember to use the raise hand function. You can see the arrow there on the left indicating under the reactions icon, the hand raise, and we will find a natural point in the presentation to pause for a moment and let you ask your question. And as well, if you go over on the top bar, there is a Q&A function here. You can always type in your question. Questions that are typed in will be addressed at the end of the presentation. We'll leave a lot of time this afternoon for everyone to have a chance to ask questions either by coming off the mute or typing them in. I'll read those out and we'll have our expert Joel answer them once the time comes. And again, once you come off of mute and you're done asking your question, please go back on mute so everyone else has opportunity to hear the questions and the answers clearly. We do operate in an inclusive and a discrimination-free manner to serve all of our customers, so staff may exclude participants who disrupt the event. Next slide, Joel. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Joel Cary. He's our TVWD Water Resources Division Manager, and he's going to be leading us as our subject matter expert today as we talk all about drinking water quality. So without further ado, Joel, take it away.
Thanks, Justin. Hi, everybody. So Joel Cary, that's my picture up there on the screen as well, so you can see, and here I am. We're just going to jump right into it today. I want to give everybody just a quick little disclaimer. We're going to try and get through these slides pretty fast. The goal of today is try and make sure we get to your questions. So at least to start, we just wanted to say, what does the Water Resource Division do here at TVWD? Well, as the title, as the slide notes, hold on, I'm getting some feedback from somebody. So if you, oh, thank you. So as the slide points out, the Water Resource Division, we do water quality monitoring, testing, compliance. We do cross-connection control. That's backflow prevention for those folks that have backflow assemblies that get tested. That's part of our team, regulatory compliance under that program. We do water rights management. We look at our water supplies, what availability do we have, and support a lot of operational planning. So that's kind of the Water Resources Division in a bucket. We do a lot of different things here at the district, and that's our core mission to support the overall district's job providing you quality drinking water. So as I just noted today's goals, we want to provide you with some context about TVWD water quality. Ultimately, we hope it's just enough to get to the point in the end where you can ask any remaining questions you might have about water quality. So again, the goal of today is to have a discussion. This is why we call these Talking Water. But hopefully we can answer a few things along the way. So first, just to orient folks, let's talk about our supplies really quick. TVWD has 3 supplies we use currently. They're all high quality sources. A lot of folks may know about these, so I'll just be super brief. Portland Water Bureau is our main supply we use right now until 2026. That constitutes about 3/4 of our supply. That's the Bull Run watershed, and Portland does do augmentation with the Columbia South Shore well field. So augmentation meaning during peak demand season or sometimes during winter storm events, groundwater gets used to supplement the Bull Run watershed supply. Our other one is the Joint Water Commission. That's TVWD, Beaverton, Hillsborough, Forest Grove. Some of you living out here have probably visited Scoggins Reservoir. Some of you may know where Barney Reservoir is as well, up in the upper, going up further into the coastal range. And our treatment plant on the upper Tolton River. So that's the other primary source that we use. That's about 25% of our supply, roughly on any given year. And our last one we use is what's called aquifer storage and recovery. That is treated drinking water that gets stored back in the ground for future use, typically the following season or the following year. There's actually several ASR projects in the area. TVWD has its own ASR storage and recovery site up on Cooper Mountain. rough numbers we use, but generally speaking, in a year we can hold from on the low end 50 million gallons up to 300 million gallons, depending on how much water we put in the ground. So all high quality, all sources we use. That gives you an idea, and this will kind of help orient you towards what we talk about in our water quality report. So as the last slide noted, Portland is our main supply until 2026. Some of you may have heard this, some of you may have not. So just as a refresher here, TVWD's future main source will be the middle and upper Willamette River. So that will be replacing our Portland supply. TVWD and the cities of Hillsborough and Beaverton have partnered to develop this source. It's currently under construction with completion scheduled for 2026. That includes a new 60 million gallon plus treatment plant, multi-barrier treatment plant. A couple things to orient you towards here is we often like to point out the intake for the plant. If we look over here in this little graphic, you can see this is where the intake is. This is why we say our source is effectively the mid and upper portions of the Willamette. We are upstream of the Falls and Oregon cities. That's a good geographic marker to think about. And as part of this effort, we're developing a regional source water protection plan expected to be adopted by spring of next year. So you'll see even more partners listed down there. I won't get into the weeds too much with all the different partnership agencies in the region, but just want to point out there's even more folks who have joined what we call the WIF Commission. So that's the intake to really think about this source as a future, this source and its future in the region as a drinking water supply. So lots of exciting stuff going on. Just want to make sure folks note that right now that we have our current kind of state, and these will be the things that are changing in the future. So just to get to some of the water quality stuff today, I want to take just a few minutes here to orient you towards what we call our annual water quality or consumer confidence report. We use this acronym. It's called the CCR. You'll see this is what the report looks like. This is available online. Why do we do this? Well, it summarizes a lot of information that we have that we just couldn't effectively put out online. So the CCR summarizes thousands of samples that both TVWD collects and our source water providers. That's Portland, that's staff of the Joint Water Commission. It's stuff that we collect from ASR. There's so many samples that get collected in this arena that we do our best to condense it down into this report. That is often a reason why it's much smaller, and we'll kind of walk through a couple of these tables in a minute. It's a way to really effectively take a snapshot for folks to see what's going on in that calendar year for the types of samples, the types of constituents that we've detected. So a couple things to note, it is available online in Spanish as well. And as I just sort of alluded to, there's a lot more data and detail that drives this report that's available, a lot more in-depth analysis that occurs periodically throughout the year that we can provide you if you're interested. A good example for that is we've got industrial folks who are more concerned about these constituents at certain levels. Obviously, folks on this call are more interested about water quality. Home brewers are individuals that we often provide information to because, again, there's more detail behind this, but we do our best to summarize it to make it easy for folks to get through, which is the intent of this. Bottom line, your water's safe to drink. That's our job. That's what we do every day around here. It's what we take great pride in. So a lot of things we'll talk about at the end of this slide, just new emerging things that we're keeping our eyes on and active steps we're taking. But bottom line is your water's safe to drink. So we hope this report reflects that. And we'll just walk through a few things about this so you can kind of understand what it all means. So at the highest level in our report, we start with source water data. If you go back to the report, if you've seen it before, if you haven't, there's a table in this report. You kind of walk through it. You can understand all the things that we've monitored, looked for. Again, first one we want to start with is just source water. We try and break it down to some of these basic things. If you can follow my cursor here, we break it down by source. So as we mentioned, the Portland Water Bureau, Joint Water Commission, and Aquifer Storage and Recovery. We do this because not all things are equal when you look at monitoring. And the way we start, at least, is the source water side of things. I want to point out that a lot of things we look for, a lot of things that get tested for in the world of drinking water are naturally occurring elements, right? So we break this down into this particular case into inorganics, metals. Fluoride is one of those naturally occurring things in the Earth's crust. Nitrate, which can be a naturally occurring ore from agricultural runoff. These aren't all the things we tested for, but these are the things that we detected and that we report on at these levels. Arsenic is another example, and lead and copper, we do test for that in other areas, but we also look at it at the source. So I just want to point out a lot of times it's important to understand that a lot of this stuff comes from the hydrologic cycle. So obviously, everybody knows it rains a lot in the Pacific Northwest. Some of these things can actually be occurring because our surface waters receive a lot of watershed rain, snow melt. It can percolate to the ground. Groundwater is another example. Constituents get picked up along the way. That's what we're really looking at right here. It can be both erosion of natural deposits and potential contamination from something else. So we do our best to summarize this. It's a lot of complex stuff. I hope that gives you a little idea of what we put out there, so you get some orientation towards exactly why it's categorized this way. Same thing, continuation source water data you'll see in our report. We do step into a different flavor of things here. This is some of our inorganic things. Turbidity is an important factor, and I want to point out when you look at some of the data that we put out in this abridged format, you'll see it's not always equal across the board. A good example in this case is because currently Portland Water Bureau is unfiltered, so you're looking at turbidity in unfiltered water supply as a different factor than the Joint Water Commission in terms of what would be filtered, right, coming out of the filtration plant. So they're not apples to apples. That's why it makes this report kind of complicated. We do our best to sort of put these together in a way that makes sense, but we totally acknowledge that it can be sort of confusing without knowing some of these key details. Other things that are important to note about the way we put the information together, there are radiological things on here. These aren't all the things that we've monitored for, but this is what we've detected. So radon, just to pick on that one for a minute, that's a naturally occurring gas from the breakdown of uranium in the soil and the ground. That's why we look for it. It does happen. It's there. It's present. That's why you'll see these ranges. This comes from Columbia South Shore well field. This is from aquifer storage recovery because we do put water underground and then take it back out and measure to see what's there. So microbiological, another example. Some of you may have seen some more information in the news recently about cryptosporidium detections. That gets monitored from Portland at a greater frequency because they're currently unfiltered. You'll see it on here that it's not monitored because there's a filtration plant. It's not that it's never been looked at, but it doesn't pose the same risk when you have a filtration plant that effectively takes it out. So, and just to make a side note, Portland is building a filtration plant that will be online in 2027, but we will no longer be on that supply. So as you work through the report, you'll see going down that table, then we get into our distribution system stuff. That's the stuff that our staff collect directly from the system. We're looking at things like contaminants related to disinfection byproducts, things in our system that we know are there because we add things like chlorination, but we do our best to make sure we minimize those through really proactive and optimal maintenance of the system. As you'll see this example up here, flushing, improving water quality, reducing water age, those are all things that we look at to make sure that we do our best to optimize the system and make sure these are the lowest concentrations possible. Things like this are inevitable in our water supply. Again, we add chlorine to prevent, as we walk through this slide here, we add chlorine to make sure we prevent things like E. coli, other bacteriological contamination. So it's kind of a balancing act as a water supply and management agency to make sure we're looking at these things simultaneously. These results, though, again, are specific to TVWD system when you look at the report, so you can understand exactly how they're collected, where they're collected, again, related to the water that comes to the pipes. Last thing you'll see on the report in terms of like the table, system water quality, again, lead and copper is another big one that we monitor for. In our region, the most notable thing that we look for, or the most notable exposure to lead, is actually through lead soldering and copper plumbing. So homes built before 1986 are really the homes that we look at in terms of risk factor. Those homes largely in the early 80s, just because they were the most recent homes built that still used lead soldering before it was banned in the middle of 1985. So we monitor from over 100 homes twice a year. The results you'll see right here are from 2022. I did want to point out that when we look at these results, it's both lead and copper. Our value we're looking at is the 90th percentiles of all the homes we sample. What was the value at the 90th percentile? A good example to think about is if you collect 100 homes, it's about the home number 90 in terms of like the top results. I wanted to point out that the most recent round we did in the spring was actually quite a bit lower as a result of improvements made from Portland in terms of their supply. They've been adjusting the corrosion control chemistry, and it's very similar to what we will have with our new supply in the Willamette. So those results are quite a bit lower than they were last time, and we are hopeful they will continue to go down. But again, to really solidify what we're trying to get at here, it really is from lead soldering and copper plumbing. There's simple steps you can do in your home to reduce exposure, and simple steps include flushing your water after it's been sitting for several hours. It's really that residence time that makes a big difference in your home. So, but again, more improvements along the way in terms of reducing that from our responsibility, making sure the water is least corrosive as possible. So that really kind of orients you towards our water quality report. I told you I was going to go fast by design. We didn't want to go through every single thing by line item. We hope to just orient you towards like what it means in terms of source. Why are these things here? How do they occur? And why do we report it the way we do? So we'd encourage anybody to take a look at that report. If you have questions, you want more details, you can call, you can email us. Anything you need to do to get more information, we're happy to respond. We're happy to help you. That's our job. That's what we do. So some other important things we wanted to touch on, what's on the horizon for TVWD's water quality, some project efforts, some key information coming up over the course of the next couple of years. So another project we have going related to water quality is what we call our service line project. So again, there's a lot of news stories right now about lead. We'll talk about PFAS in a minute. So, but just to touch on lead for a second, there's recent EPA compliance that all drinking water systems must comply with to look to see if they have any lead service lines, or to identify all the lead service lines that they suspect in their system. So for TVWD, this is our effort to prove that we don't have lead service lines. We've never found one to date. We don't think we do. So we're taking a very proactive approach to this project. We are combining physical assessments of nearly 400 randomly selected service lines, and then we're going to compare that with some statistical modeling. So our goal with this, even though we feel confident that we don't have lead service lines, it's still our job to protect public health. So our goal is to make sure that we prove that theory, to make sure that we confirm that we are truly at very low risk for any type of exposure in our system, at least from lead. That does not mean there's still not exposure from the home side, but that's where our efforts to make sure we improve the water chemistry comes into play. So this is a project some of you on this call may in fact actually be one of our randomly selected folks. So if you are, you'll probably receive something in the mail in the coming months. It's not a very invasive process. We're just going to take a look around the meter box, do a small amount of excavation, make sure we can get accurate information about the service line on both the customer side and the TVWD side, to make sure we can confirm exactly what those materials look like. We know a lot of our materials out there in the system, but this really gives us records for some of the older things that, again, we don't have a piece of paper or a physical copy of an installation that said it was this material going back into the 60s and 70s and 50s for some of these situations. So that's another big project we're working on. Another one that's been in the news, several folks actually responded to us in terms of this notification that went out for the Talking Water Forum about PFAS. So some of you may have seen this article. It's been gaining a lot of traction since last Friday. This article from Time Magazine, and I know a lot of other publications have picked it up. It's actually based on a recent USGS study that estimated nearly half of our water sources. So to be clear, that's both public and private, could contain these compounds based on USGS's national study over the course of several years. So I just want to highlight PFAS is something that we've been tracking. I've got a slide in here that talks about the efforts we've taken over the course of the last decade. We're just as concerned as you are, and frankly, we're committed to making sure that you all receive safe, high-quality drinking water as well. A little bit of orientation towards PFAS here. This might be just rehashing information for everybody, but it's a good visual to understand. PFAS, where are they? Frankly, they're everywhere. They're ubiquitous in the environment. They are in everything from food packaging to water-resistant materials, water-resistant finishes on clothing and furniture, cosmetics, paint, nonstick cookware is an obvious one that a lot of folks know about. And another really big one I want to point out is firefighting foams. A lot of the information you'll see in the news, not all of it, but clearly a lot of it can be associated with groundwater contamination. Aqueous firefighting foams, which get used a lot in training at airports for putting out, jet fuel. A lot of those over the decades that have leached into the ground are causing some of these groundwater contamination events. So again, just to point out, though, they are everywhere in the environment. We kind of joke about it in some ways, but I'm sure all of us have some of PFAS compounds on them, which is why it makes it very difficult for us to understand exactly all the exposure pathways. The one though that we can focus on, at least as an agency, is the water side of things. So what's TVWD done and what are we doing? Going back a little ways, there's what we call the unregulated contaminant monitoring rule. So going back to 2013 and 15, TVWD, and in fact, all the other regional providers in the area as well, sampled for 6 PFAS compounds, ready for the tongue twister, polyfluoroalkyl substances. That's what PFAS actually stands for. Back in 2013 and 15, at that time there was 6 targeted PFAS, because may not seem like it, but 10 years is quite a while in terms of studying research. So those are the 6 targeted ones that we looked at, and in the region from our other sources and water providers as well, and not just TVWD. No detections were discovered during that time. However, we are renewing those efforts under an update to this new rule. These are designed to look at emerging contaminants across the country and regionally. So TVWD and our regional partners, starting this month, in fact, TVWD will be collecting for these 29 PFAS compounds and lithium during a 12-month period. So for the next calendar year, TVWD will be directly testing for those PFAS, for 29 PFAS compounds, an expanded list since our last monitoring effort. I wanted to point out a couple things about this. The reporting limits are lower this time. The detection methods have been in existence for the last 10 years, but given the advances in the testing laboratory capabilities, our reliable reporting limits have gone down quite a bit. So a lot of these compounds we can reliably report down to 2 to 3 parts per trillion, which is quite low. So that gives us a much broader ability to take a look for these things. And it really does relate to what I said in the prior slide, that these compounds are ubiquitous, they're everywhere. It's just a way to frame it to say that the chances do increase because of how low we're going, because of the expanded set, that we may discover some of these. There's a lot of very robust processes in place for the sampling methodology, but that doesn't mean that there couldn't be some minor cross-contamination. So all that to say, it's 100% transparency of what we do around here. All the results will be posted online as they're available sometime in the August timeframe when we expect to get results back. We will be putting up or standing up a small subpage with some additional information that we just talked about today. But again, we're going to make it very clear when we test these, when we take these samples and get the results back, they're going to be posted and publicly available as soon as possible. So I put this picture up here because I think it's really important for folks to know one thing about PFAS-based compounds. Why does the news, why does the research industry, why do we water professionals call these forever chemicals? It's because the fluorine and carbon combined creates one of the strongest bonds known as chemistry. So when you pair those 2 elements together, it's very, very difficult to break that bond of the fluorine and the carbon. So that's why they're called forever chemicals. They don't break down, they don't degrade in the environment like a lot of other constituents will. That's why these things are so difficult and challenging for a lot of for their fate in the environment and in some ways treatment, depending on what you're looking at. So another one I just want to touch on, hopefully this answers some other questions too. Microplastics, this is another area. There's a lot of emerging research and study right now. One of the jobs we do here at the district is to make sure that we are on top of this. We attend presentations, seminars, read the research about what's going on. I just wanted to be proactive and highlight this for everybody. Microplastics are something that we've seen in the news a lot, and it's still an emerging field of study. What we do know so far is that occurrence can vary quite widely based on what you're looking at. So sampling, just understanding how they occur in the environment, whether or not they're on the surface of a water body or in the water column, can vary greatly. So I point this out because, again, there's still a lot of uncertainty for how you even do this in terms of accurately monitoring and quantifying what you're seeing. We also know treatment is largely effective at removing microplastics, but that's based on particulate size and the exact process we're talking about. Just an example, we have what's called, most conventional treatment has what's called sedimentation up front in a plant, where you basically create larger particles for the process to get those particles to settle out in the water column. So it's quite effective. In fact, I was just at a seminar earlier this year about that. And again, that's the good news for the industry, is that a lot of our traditional treatment methods are good at removing microplastics. Last thing I wanted to point out, California actually was the first state/regulatory agency in the world frankly, to adopt some methods for testing and monitoring in July of 2021. Those actually just kicked in as far as the requirements in 2022. So that's actually 2 years of source water testing, followed by 2 years of treated drinking water testing that California will be undertaking. And again, as I doing the quick math here, if you're fast on the fly of that, it kicked in 2022 in terms of the requirements to do it. That means we'll be getting some results, preliminary results, or California's Water Resource Control Board will in 2024. Why do I mention all this? Well, this will heavily inform some of our planning as well. And given the fact that California is leading the way, that will definitely drive future rulemaking from a national or a state perspective as a neighbor to the north. So I just want to point out again that we are tracking and monitoring this stuff. This is kind of the job that we do here, aside from the physical things that we go out and some of our staff here who go collect samples, our partnership staff who collect samples for the source water. All these things combined, that's what we do in terms of the water quality aspect and why we collect all this information and do our best to share it. So I told you I was going to go relatively fast, so I didn't want to take up too much of everybody's time in terms of a presentation slide. So I hope that gives you enough context. And now is the Q&A part. So I did not see the chat, so hopefully there's some questions, and Justin's going to take it from here.
Yes, Joel, there's definitely some questions in here. I've got, I just realized actually that Teams did an update and they're loading from the bottom up now. So I've got it all tracked by time. First question comes from Elizabeth C, who asks, or I should say, says, my water tastes different and it seems to affect me differently in the past year. How has the water quality changed over the past year or so? And can we share any data graphs about the last year?
Yeah, great question. We've consistently used our two sources, Elizabeth. One of the things, depends on where you live in our district. This is probably the best answer I can give you. So we haven't changed sources, but oftentimes those sources will shift throughout our system. Depending on where you're at in our location, you may be receiving one of those sources more than the other at certain times of year. One thing we often ask people is, hey, if you notice something different or change, feel free to call us and give us your location. We can actually pinpoint exactly which source is there. Again, those sources haven't changed. They're both high quality, but there are slight differences to some of them. Some of the chlorination practices that get used are just different enough to where people could notice them, and that may be something you're experiencing. But we're happy to share more details. If you're able to send us an email, tell us your address, we can give you a lot more precise information about what may be going on. So.
Yep. And that email address, I believe, is WQ for water quality
Yes.
at tvwd.org. So WQ at tvwd.org. Elizabeth, please send us that email, put in your address, and we're happy to respond to you. The next question comes from Elizabeth F, who has a question about the Willamette source water. Question is, isn't the Willamette River highly polluted? I know there's been a cleanup effort over the last 10 years. However, I know there have been fish with 4 eyes and frogs with 6 legs. It's been recommended that no one swim in that river, let alone drink it. No matter how you try to clean it up, it is undrinkable. Joel, want to comment on that?
Yeah, Elizabeth. Yep. So one thing, and thanks for the question too. We understand there's a lot of uncertainty and/or concern about it. One thing we try and say clearly, and I'm going to go back to my slide just to help orient us towards this. So one thing we would try and be very clear about is that our source and our intake is actually in the Mid-Willamette. So this is actually a picture of the Mid-Willamette. This is what we call the Newburgh Pool. The Newburgh Pool is a stretch that extends roughly from where Newburgh starts to the the falls in Oregon City. It's a very different stretch of river than what we talk about in terms of the some of the things we talk about, do not swim advisories related to more of the urban outfalls and the central Portland metro area. I also want to be clear. We clearly understand that there are still risks with any source. That just is a blanket statement for any source of water you're looking at. So it's not to try and diminish the fact that there's still concerns about it. But frankly, the quality of the water in the Willamette is great. There's been a lot of extensive testing of the raw water going back 30 years in this section of the river. I think folks may know this, but the river has improved greatly in terms of water quality. That's supported by an extensive amount of DEQ testing and even early pilot testing we did 20 years ago. I should also add that the city of Wilsonville and Sherwood have been using this source for Wilsonville for nearly 20 years and Sherwood for over 10 years right now. So there's an existing plant on that river right now that's producing very high quality water in terms of looking at both raw water and finished water. just to be blunt about it, we just don't see those constituents or contaminants. So there's been a lot of testing on it. We're really hopeful that we can show people more data in the coming months and years about why this is such a great source. Oftentimes we feel like a picture is worth 1,000 words, which is why we share a lot of these pictures, because that gives you an idea of exactly what the source looks like itself. So I'll probably end by saying if there are certain things that you're even more concerned about, if you've got a specific contaminant or anything else that you are thinking about, feel free to shoot us an email as well. Like, we'd happily take the conversation and spend as much time talking to you about what your concerns might be.
Thanks, Joel. We've got 3 questions from Buzz up next. First one is about his espresso maker, which seems to die from scale buildup almost annually. It seems to occur in the August timeframe in spite of efforts to descale it about every 3 months. Can you speak to any minerals in the water and why this might be happening in the late summer?
It could be Buzz. So first thing, thank you. I'm gonna laugh because Justin might smile because he knows I'm a total coffee drinker too. So way to go, man. Anyway, so typically our water around here is pretty soft. There is, as I mentioned up earlier, there is some augmentation that happens occasionally with Portland Supply with the Columbia South Shore well field. I'm just going to go back to this slide. And aquifer storage and recovery can at times for our supply be a little bit harder. Generally speaking, they're not super hard, but it could just be enough. Anytime you heat up your water, you're going to cause some of those minerals to precipitate out faster. It's not a lot of groundwater, but it could just be enough to cause the issue you're talking about in terms of some of that scale buildup. So it's probably the best answer I can give you in terms of like what might be causing it, because overall 70-80% of the time our water is still quite soft.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And then Buzz's next question relates to the ASR and pumping water back into the ground. Does it affect the water table height on Cooper Mountain?
That's actually a great question. Short version is, yeah, a little bit actually, it does. So it's a little bit more nuanced in terms of like a good way to think about the aquifers. It's actually layers, right? There's like layers of different materials. There's softer materials or harder materials. There's, really we look at like sedimentary layers and basalt layers, which is where we operate in. We look at wells around the area. They're called our observation wells. When we do recharge, we do see an impact in those wells where the water column will rise in some of those wells. But that's also because some of those wells have a connection with that layer that we're operating in. So it's not necessarily like a one-to-one correlation, for lack of a better term, but there is definitely a response in the groundwater at certain layers, certain levels in the ground, if you will, for lack of a better term. So that's something we keep track of. As I just said, we do observational monitoring around the area to maintain that and make sure we understand exactly what's going on. And frankly, we also look for visual seeps. That's just, when we started this project 12 years ago, we would drive around and make sure that we didn't see anything that was actually just bubbling up out of the ground somewhere from a natural seep. So, yeah, good question though.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
And Buzz's final questions is, I might butcher the name of this laboratory, but I'm going to say Battelle Labs has found a way to break the PFAS bond and is currently treating water on a small scale. Are we tracking and or investigating this effort?
I know what you're talking about, Buzz. I can't recall exactly. I know the research because I think they were, and I don't want to speak. I remember seeing it too, and it was a newer emerging technology, and I can't remember if it involved heat or not, but I remember what you're talking about. So I'm sorry if I can't recall it correctly, but short answer is yes, those are the things that we're watching and tracking when we say research about what some of the most prevalent technologies are. So for treatment of PFAS.
Yeah, I think they said they were doing something like 500,000 gallons a month or something like that in a container-sized facility. So it appears to be a promising development.
Yeah,
something we ought to keep our eyes on, I guess.
Yeah, 100%. I think what we often look at those are the emergency, that's where the research comes into play, right? Small scale starts to big scale. So a lot of the research that you're talking about does come back to us in the form of like conferences we attend. So it's exactly what we keep track of. So yeah, that's a great point. Thank you for bringing it up. I should just add to that, just to riff on it for 1 second. there are available technologies out there for treatment of PFAS. I just want to be clear with folks, and some of that's pretty tried and true through with absorption through GAC or other resin-based polymers. Those are things that exist. They're known how to do. There's a lot of areas across the country now that are installing treatment because they truly have a major PFAS problem. So those things exist right now. It's really just, I think the emerging part of this is that how widespread the contamination is and at what level. So that's really what everyone's trying to grapple with right now. And there's a lot of behind the scenes information about this from our industry. Frankly, the concerns from the public, which is you all as the community, we're your public water supply agency. Our rate, you pay for our rates. One of the biggest concerns that's being expressed on a national level to Congress is why would the communities be left holding the bag for these costs? So that's something our industry has been very adamant about, that the pollution didn't come from us, it came from these industries and known usage of these compounds for decades, even though the risks were known. So I just want to point that out because the treatment is not cheap, and as an industry, we are very clear and fight on the behalf of our ratepayers and consumers that needs to be thought about when you talk about treatment for these compounds.
All right, I'm going to jump over to the meeting chat because I saw some questions popping up there, and then we'll return to the Q&A in a moment. We've got a question from Tim who asks, if you find some PFAS chemicals in the water, how can you treat it to remove those?
Yep. So just like I just mentioned, the most common technology right now is granular activated carbon contact chambers, or like resin-based. It's like resin-based polymer, resin-based materials that go in these contact vessels, if you will. So really what you're talking about in simplified terms is material that's really good at absorbing something like PFAS compounds because they're slippery by nature, and enough contact time within that chamber to where the water can move slow enough to come into contact with the GAC or the resin beads to absorb the PFAS. And then you have to dispose of the PFAS as toxic waste. So, or sorry, potentially the material inside those contact chambers. So that's one of the most common things in terms of what gets used for that type of treatment. It's not something we've looked into an extensive use at because we haven't seen the risk for PFAS in our region as other areas, but that's why we're also doing this extended round of a much expanded group at much lower detection limits. So, because again, as we keep pointing out, these things are everywhere in the environment too. It's just your exposure pathway is probably much higher through non-drinking water sources in reality. But again, we have to do our part to make sure that we're reducing everything we can on the drinking water side.
All right, Joel, our next question is from Kathy, who writes, the Wall Street Journal reported, I should say, the Willamette River is contaminated with lead from old communication cables. Now that you are switching to the river as a source, will you be testing this more often?
Yeah, Kathy, if you have that, whenever we have these forums, we'd love to see information. So if you have that article or can find it, please send it our way. We'd love to be able to see it. I haven't seen that. But again, heavy metals are things that could be present in the river from old industrial uses. The source water actually frequently gets tested for lead from the existing providers. Wilsonville and Sherwood is just part of mainly Wilsonville because they operate the plant. And as we actually as we finish our plant and by 2026, yes, we'll be doing additional source water monitoring on top of that for all those constituents. I want to go back to this slide really quick because you'll see it right here. So lead from source water and copper, those are all things that we do from every source. So all of our partners, we will continue to do that type of analysis and testing, not just on, again, as I pointed out, the plumbing side where we focus a lot of our efforts, but on the source water side as well.
Awesome. And then we think we've got one more here in the Q&A. Question is it okay to boil and filter water before drinking?
Yes, absolutely. The only asterisk I'd put by that is like it's not necessary for our drinking water unless we told you to. Really, boiling is effective at killing microorganisms. If you're thinking about boiling water because you want to reduce contaminant, it doesn't typically work that way. When you're talking about, again, boiling water, there's it's like distillation is a process too, but just generally speaking, yes, it's totally fine. It's not necessary for our water. But if you're out doing something in an area where you're concerned about the quality of the water, potentially yes. And if we ever had to issue a notice, you'd hear from us within 24 hours or less, likely within hours if there was ever a risk that we said, hey, boil water is exactly what you need to do. We found some bacteria. Those notices will go out right away. Even if we think it's still not a major risk, we err on the side of caution with public health, just to be clear.
And we've got another question from Tim, who asks, if you are testing for copper in our water, why would copper piping still be available for plumbing?
Copper, maybe it's kind of twofold. Copper is a great material for plumbing, to be honest, in terms of how long it lasts. Our copper levels that we see are quite low, which is good. I would point out that copper is an essential nutrient. So just to be clear, a lot of these things we look at kind of have a dual role, right? Like at one level, they can be toxic, but at the other end of the scale, they're actually an essential nutrient. So it's not inherently just bad per se, but copper is a really good material for plumbing. It lasts a really long time. You know, I'm not trying to make a comparison. I just want to point folks, there's differences for all types of plumbing materials too. Even some of the newer plastic synthetic stuff has some of its own pros and cons as well. So I hope that answered your question. Copper is great. We monitor for it. We see really low levels typically in all of our monitoring anyway. So.
And as of right now, that's the final question. So we'll do one last call here. Folks, if you have any questions you'd like to ask of Joel, type them in the chat or the Q&A, or go ahead and raise your hand. We'll have you ask them in real time. So we got one more here. From Buzz, just FYI, the Battelle system is called PFAS Annihilator. And according to their statements, it destroys PFAS and is a completely closed system.
Thank you, Buzz. Yeah, I'll make sure to look it up again too. So I know yeah, and the name.
Yeah, I used to work at Battelle Labs decades ago. I don't work there now. I'm not advertising for them. Your mileage may vary.
Yeah. No, that's super helpful. We'd like to know anything about that too, because the PFAS conversation is going to increase right now because all of us are going to be talking about our results over the next year or 2 years. So this is good information to have.
Yep.
Fantastic. Well, it looks like that's our final question and comment through the written form in the chat. So we'll wait another second here, give it the 8 seconds before we close out. All right, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for July's edition of Talkin' Water. We hope you're all able to access this information on your annual water quality report, your CCR, and please reach out wq@tvwd.org with any other questions. And thanks again for joining us today.
Thanks all.
Thank you.